My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division at the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our 2022 series of all virtual NLM history talks. And to those of you on Twitter, thank you very much for following along using the hashtag NLMHistTalk. NLM history talks promote awareness and use of NLM and related historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the very strong commitment of the NLM in two specific ways. Commitment to recognizing the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. As well as the commitment of the library to foreground the voices of people of color, women, and individuals of a variety of cultural and disciplinary backgrounds who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. We supplement NLM history talks with speaker interviews on our blog, Circulating Now, which is located at circulatingnow.nlm.nih.gov. I'll add that NLM history talks are made possible by an outstanding team here at the National Library of Medicine and at the NIH, and particularly at NIH Videocasting. And I want to thank each and every one of them, this great team, for their time and their talent in bringing this program to you, the global public. I also wish to thank them for helping me orchestrate the Q&A following today's talk. And in this regard, I'd like to call your attention to the live feedback button underneath the video stream you're watching. And please use this feature to send questions to me, and I'll share them with our speaker during our Q&A. So it's my great privilege and pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Samuel Thrope, Curator of the Islam and Middle Eastern Collection at the National Library of Israel. It is a great pleasure to have him join us today from Jerusalem. He is a widely published author and translator. He has written for both scholarly journals and popular newspapers and magazines, and he is the translator of Iranian author Jamal al-Hamad's 1963 Israel travelogue, The Israeli Republic. And with Dr. Domenico Agostini of the ancient Iranian book, Buddhism, the Zoroastrian Book of Creation. He is also editor with Dr. Roberta Casagrande Kim and Dr. Raquel Yukes of the exhibition catalog, Romance and Reason, Islamic Transformations of the Classical Past, an exhibition to which the National Library of Medicine loaned many of its collections several years ago. Dr. Thrope began his career at the National Library of Israel with his appointment as Persian language cataloger in 2011. In 2013, he became the selector for new books in English, French, German, and Persian for the Islam and Middle East collection. In that role, he helped plan special events, exhibitions, and public programs, as well as representing the National Library of Israel at national and international gatherings. After a brief hiatus, he returned to the National Library of Israel in 2020. Today, he joins us for a virtual tour of the Islamic medical manuscripts in the National Library of Israel collections. These manuscripts number more than 2,500. They are in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and they date from the 9th to the 19th centuries. Among these are numerous rare and important copies of works that attest to the history of Islamic medicine. While the bulk of these medical manuscripts were donated by the 20th century scholar and manuscript dealer Abraham Shalom Yehuda, who sold the National Library of Medicine its own Islamic manuscript collection during the early 1940s, others were acquired over the course of decades. Dr. Thrope's talk will provide a guided tour of the National Library of Israel's Islamic medical collection, focusing in particular on rare and unique manuscripts, which can shed light on the National Library of Medicine's own collection, which is among the best in the world. Dr. Thrope, welcome from Jerusalem, and thank you very much for taking your time from your schedule today and joining us with this wonderful talk, which I know many are looking forward to, and I personally am. And I'm grateful for our communication and your time in preparing. So over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to you for organizing the talk today and for inviting me to speak as part of this series. It's a great honor and a privilege to participate along with the distinguished lecturers you've had so far. And thanks also to your team for their conscientiousness and professionalism in putting together the pieces of everything leading up to the talk today. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to present to the audience and to the National Library of Medicine. As you say, there are numerous connections between our two collections, and we're going to talk about some of those today. What I'll do, as you said, is I'm going to present a bit about the history of the Islamic Manuscript Collection at the National Library of Israel overall, and focus on the stories of the collection, or selected stories, because there are many, that will provide some examples of the kinds of items, manuscripts, rare and precious medical texts that we have here at the National Library of Israel Collections. I want to say a few more words about myself, but I should probably begin with a couple of caveats. As everyone knows, President Joe Biden is visiting Jerusalem today. So there's the sound of helicopters that I can hear in the background. I don't know if you can, but that's going on. And also my kids are eating pizza in the other room. So that's another background noise that you might be hearing over the course of the talk. I actually grew up in Boston. I was born and raised in Boston, and I'm a proud New Englander to this day, even though I've lived in Jerusalem for more than a decade. My academic background, as you mentioned, Jeff, is in Iranian studies. So not in medicine and not in the history of science. So please excuse me if I make any medical technical blunders over the course of the talk. My work these days as curator of the Islam and Middle East collection is, it really touches on everything that we have in the National Library of Israel that relates to the literatures, cultures, and societies of the Middle East. So the Islam and Middle East collection is one of the 4 core collections at our library today, the others being Judaica, Israel, and the Humanities, so represented by these 4 iconic images, iconic items that you can see on the screen here. The Judaica, I'll just say a few words about this. The Israel and Judaica collections are both the largest and most comprehensive of their kind in the world, which aim to collect everything related to the cultural products, the written cultural products in particular of the Jewish people as a whole, and the state of Israel, and the pre-state Jewish collective before it was founded in 1948. The Islam and Middle East collection and the Humanities collection are both more research collections focused on collecting, in the broadest sense of the term, the materials, among them books, manuscripts, periodicals, archives, and ephemera related to the classical world in modern Europe, in the medieval and modern Europe in the case of the Humanities collection, and also, as I'll say a few more words about, Arabic, Persian, Turkish literatures, cultures, and histories in the case of the Islam and Middle East collection. While medicine, in particular, and science overall are not the particular focus of any of the 4 core collections, each includes copies of important medical manuscripts in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and other languages. The Islam and Middle East collection is the most important of its kind in Israel, and includes, in addition to manuscripts, more than 500,000 books, hundreds of thousands of photos, a unique collection of Palestinian newspapers from the Ottoman and British Mandate periods, music, ethnographic recordings, archives, and ephemera. And actually in 2024, so in just over a year and a half, the Islam and Middle East collection will celebrate its 100th birthday. And I think I wanted to begin with that approaching anniversary. So nearly a century ago, in October 1924, the citizens of British Mandate Jerusalem gathered to celebrate the arrival of an intellectual treasure. This was the Gold's Ear Library, which had arrived in the city just a few months earlier, was now being opened for the reading public. It comprised the private scholarly library of the celebrated Hungarian Jewish professor and researcher on Islam, Ignaz Goldziher, and the 6,000 volumes that constituted this library had been bought by the Zionist organization and shipped from Budapest to Jerusalem in order to found the Islam and Arabic Research Collection of the nascent Hebrew University, of which the National Library was then a part. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars and notables, as well as British mandate officials and members of the diplomatic corps, came together to mark the occasion. Judah Magnus, the prominent Reform rabbi who would become the first chancellor of the Hebrew University, and Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, both addressed the gathering. They emphasized in their talks how in the Goldziher Library, scholars from all races and religions of the land of Israel would meet in collective effort. The new librarian, who had been appointed to manage and catalog the collection, spoke as well. This was David Tzvi Banet, who has a great and illustrious history at the National Library of Israel. He was a former head of Oriental Manuscripts at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, and in the end became the director of the library. So this image on the screen you can see here is actually the library building at that time, up until 1925. And to celebrate, or I suppose to house really, technically the new Goldziher Library, founding library of Islam and Middle East at the National Library of Israel, they rented a special additional house, a four-room house to house the collection. You can see these pictures from an album that was created right around the time to document and to preserve this transition. So two of the rooms in this new house were dedicated to the Goldziher Library, and the remaining two rooms were left free to accommodate the expansion of the collection. Just to give a sense of what we're talking about, Goldziher's 6,000 volumes represented a massive addition to the holdings of the library, which just a few years before, in 1919, had stood at only 30,000 volumes. So those 6,000, this collection included actually 13 manuscripts, which Goldziher had bought during his lifetime and which had served him as primary sources in his scholarship. And while these weren't actually medical manuscripts, unfortunately, though Goldziher did work on Islamic medicine as part of his scholarly career, the 13 manuscripts served as a foundation for the entire Islamic manuscript collection that we had, which, as mentioned, numbers some 2,500 items, the first of which came in 1924, and the latest of which arrived really only just a month ago. The library was very fortunate to receive the donation of the scholarly library and archives of Shaul Shaked, the late eminent researcher in Iranian studies, Judeo Persian, and other topics. So his collection included some dozen manuscripts in Persian, which are now being scanned, cataloged, and included in our collection. So the Islam and Middle East manuscript collection as a whole it spans over 1,000 years of Islamic manuscript culture, from the 9th to the 19th centuries, includes items from Muslim Spain to Indonesia. All the major fields of Islamic studies are represented, including Quran, Hadith, law, literature, mysticism, and more, as well, of course, as the exact sciences. Of this latter group, there are some 120 manuscripts that deal with medical and related topics. Here's another picture of the Goldziher Library. And what I thought to do during the course of this talk and the time that we have is to tell you two stories. Two stories about the history of the manuscript collection, two stories related to our manuscripts. And rather than give a a broad overview to delve a little bit deeper into some of the items. So that being said, we can start with the story of the individual you can see here. This is Abraham Shalom Yehuda in his formal academic garb from the University of Madrid. Yehuda was a student of Ignaz Goldziher, who I just mentioned, and a pivotal figure in 20th century manuscript history, in particular in relation to Islamic manuscripts, a pivotal figure in the history of the Zionist movement, and also a pivotal figure in the history of the library. I want to tell you Yehuda's story, not only because, as you've already heard, his donation of more than 1,000 manuscripts makes up the bulk of our collection and also includes the most rare and precious items. But because I think the story of Yehuda and his passionate commitment to Islamic book history, to collecting and preserving Arabic and Islamic culture in manuscript form is sort of fed into the DNA of the library and the DNA of the collection, and gives a great window onto who we were and our values. So Yehuda was born into a Jerusalem Jewish family in 1871, and he actually left home for Germany in 1896, where he earned his doctorate with a thesis on the medieval Andalusian Jewish scholar Bachya ibn Pekuda from the University of Strasbourg in 1904. Yehuda was no stranger, though, to Arabic, to the melding of Jewish and Arab culture. He actually grew up speaking Arabic in his home. His family was of mixed Eastern and European Jewish heritage, with roots both in Germany and in Iraq. He was also fluent in French, German, and Hebrew, of course, as well as English. So, as I mentioned, Yehuda completed his dissertation under the tutelage of the eminent scholar Theodor Noldeke, but the work is actually dedicated to Goldziher, with whom he maintained a lifelong relationship. So he writes in the thesis, he was indeed the first one, that is Goldziher, who prompted me to do this edition of the book that he had loved in his youth. He considered it a noble duty to support me in every way and advised me with wise counsel until the end. Yehuda taught in Berlin and then in Madrid, where he had held the first chair, the first chair in Jewish studies in Europe and North America. And throughout his career, he published widely scholarly articles on Arabic literature, Islam, Spanish Jewish history, the Bible, and other topics, as well as numerous pieces for the popular press. So here we have, and I'm very excited to share this, a letter from Ignaz Goldziher to Yehuda, dated 28 July 1902, one of the dozens of letters between the two kept in the archives in the National Library of Israel, and also at the also in Budapest. And Yehuda, as part of his rising academic career, was set to join the founding faculty of the Hebrew University, which opened in 1925 on Mount Scopus here in Jerusalem. In the end, that appointment didn't come through for reasons that are not entirely clear. Yehuda was in some ways a difficult figure, a very acerbic figure, so it perhaps was even for personal reasons. And after not receiving his appointment, Yehuda turned to manuscripts. The family had a long history in the book trade. His brother was an important book dealer out of Cairo, who also traded in manuscripts. And Yehuda leveraged his scholarly expertise into basically becoming one of the most important dealers and collectors of Islamic manuscripts in the 20th century. Over the course of his career, he sold manuscripts to the University of Michigan, the British Library, the University of Heidelberg, Princeton University, and the National Library of Medicine, of course. And the letter that you can see here, which is from the Yehuda archive at our library in Jerusalem, is from Robert Garrett, who was a benefactor to Princeton University and helped build Princeton's huge and extremely important Islamic manuscript collection. So I'll just read this sentence because I think it gives a sense of how Yehuda was seen by his contemporaries. So he writes, "I'm very glad to have your letter of October 12th. I've read it with interest. It would seem from what you say, as well as from your great knowledge of the subject, which implies that you would select Arabic manuscripts with great care, that your collection is an unusual one. I wish I could add it to my collection. I don't think it would be possible in the future. Economic difficulties, et cetera, et cetera." This is a letter from 1931, so we know what economic difficulties he's talking about. In the end, Garrett did acquire, as I said, a huge number of manuscripts from Yehuda, which are now part of the Princeton collection. And when Yehuda passed away in 1951, his remaining collection was bequeathed to the Hebrew University and to the National Library of Israel, which at that point was a single institution. This includes not only 1,186 Islamic manuscripts, but also his book collection, his vast personal archive. We've already seen some examples of that. Isaac Newton's theological papers, an archive documenting Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt and the Levant, as well as other items. So the Yehuda Collection at the National Library of Israel is the most important bequest that our library has ever received. And we treasure it so much and have invested a lot of effort in cataloging and publishing our catalog of the collection because it really is full of treasures. It includes a number of rare items written near or just after the author's lifetimes, items that were part of royal libraries, illustrated, illuminated, and gilded manuscripts, and more. So one of the treasures of the Yehuda collection is what I'd like to talk about with you today, and you can actually see it on the screen right now. So this is a 13th century copy of Ibn Sina Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, a text that I'm sure is familiar to almost everyone listening today. Foundational text in the history of medicine and in both in the Middle East and in Europe and the Western world. Avicenna, of course, was an illustrious 11th century philosopher as well as physician. And the canon, completed in 25, was a foundational text almost from its composition until the 19th century. It's an encyclopedic 5-volume summary of medical knowledge up until his own days, continuing and summarizing the tradition of classical and Hellenistic Greek medicine that was then translated into Arabic and further expanded and refined beginning in the 8th century. So this particular manuscript dates some 200 years after Avicenna's death. And I want to share it not because it's the oldest of Avicenna's works in the library collections. We actually have an 11th century copy of Avicenna's major philosophical opus, The Healing. But the interest in and importance of this manuscript actually lies in the expansive commentaries and paratexts that it contains. We don't know much about the copyist. We know he was a Persian-speaking physician and that the manuscript was copied in Iran. And the reason we lack the rest of this information is because the manuscript has been damaged at some point during its history. The first and last pages of the codex are missing, and what you're seeing now on the screen is actually the first preserved page. So this is clearly, it doesn't, begin with a natural sentence. So obviously it's not the first page of the work. And the colophon, right at the end of the manuscript, in which the copyist would write his name, the date, perhaps where he copied the manuscript, all that relevant information is also lost. So even though we don't have the colophon, the copyist's name, this manuscript is full of marginalia. And as a student, and I emphasize the student of Islamic codicology, these commentaries, ownership notes, reading notes, listening notes, all kinds of things, all these paratexts that surround the main text of the manuscript, in my mind, are often even more interesting than the text itself. So there are actually two examples of, or which is to say, not two examples, but there are actually two writers of marginal notes in this manuscript. One is the copyist himself, and then there's in a different later hand, there's additional notes and additional comments throughout the work. And this is, I'm sure I'm repeating information that's well known, but this is a common feature of the study of the history of the book and of manuscript culture, where texts themselves were prized, extremely valuable. There are few copies made even of such a popular work as the canon, and the marginalia were essential parts of the transmission, use, reading, and study of the manuscript. So as you can see on the page here, which I've highlighted, throughout the text, the lines, sometimes in red and sometimes in black, over certain passages indicate the texts that are going to be copied, that are going to be commented on. The copyist, in his marginal comments, refers to a number of other illustrious figures in the history of Islamic medicine and Greek medicine before: Hippocrates, Galen, the 9th century Christian physician Ayub al-Rahawi, the early 13th century philosopher, as well as a physician, Ar-Razi, Ibn al-Nafis, the Damascene physician who was the first to describe the pulmonary circulation of blood, and other figures. In addition to references to earlier physicians and their arguments or corrections of Ibn Sina's own work, there's also linguistic notes. So in a different case, the copyist tries to explicate and sort of define a rare word in the text by quoting a single couplet of Persian poetry, which is very cool and very interesting, move that he makes in the text. So reading these notes is not only useful for us to illuminate the history of Islamic medicine and the intellectual history of the canon over the centuries, in particular in Iran, in particular in Persian, but it actually helps us date the manuscript. So the note that's circled here, right on the bottom of the page, is the note that refers to Ibn al-Nafis, as I said, a physician scholar who lived in Damascus and Cairo, very important in Islamic medical history. Ibn al-Nafis, and his name here is again circled. He died in 1288. And even though we don't have a date right from the colophon of the manuscript, this reference tells us that the manuscript can't be much earlier than the end of the 13th century, and is extremely illuminating, meaning that the painstaking work of reading and identifying the scholars mentioned in these notes has actually helped us date this copy and helped us further define and further drill down on the codicological and historical details of our Yehuda collection. I also want to take the opportunity to recognize Lina Jabali, a doctoral student at the University of Tel Aviv, working on Islamic codicology, who's also a member at the team at the National Library of Israel, and has worked thoroughly on studying this manuscript. So even if the name of the copyist doesn't appear, the names of later owners do, which gives further insight into how these manuscripts, how these items move through space and time. So here on folio 5 recto, right early in the book, we find a reference to a later owner, one Abdurrahman ibn al-Ma'la Muhammad al-Husseini from Istanbul. And for the Arabic readers among you, you can see Constantina here right at the end of the note. As far as I know, this individual, Abdurrahman, hasn't been identified outside of sort of isn't mentioned in the scholarly literature, but almost an identical ownership entry appears on a different Yehuda manuscript, a compendium of Illuminatius philosophy that's cataloged in our collection as Yehuda 201. There, though, and you can see the image and the text from Yehuda 201 here. The date is mentioned. The date of 1151. This discovery, which again, thanks to Lina for pointing it out, Lina Jabali, is fascinating because it means that it tells us possibly a little bit more about Yehuda. If two manuscripts both came from the library of the same Abdurrahman in Istanbul sometime in the 17th century, that may indicate that either Yehuda himself or one of his associates purchased a library that remained in the family's collection, or when Abdurrahman's own library was broken up, someone else bought the bulk of it and was incorporated into a different collection. But a further challenge for me and for us, the National Library of Israel, is trying to trace the threads and see where else manuscripts belonging to this figure show up around the world, perhaps also in the National Library of Medicine, perhaps in other institutions with Yehuda collections. I'm fascinated and inspired to keep working on this question. So the other previous owner, who deserves note, of course, is Yehuda himself. His name, in this case, doesn't appear in the manuscript, but this sticker does, right on the flyleaf. These kinds of markings with the title in Arabic, of course, along with several different numbering systems in parallel, is quite typical of Yehuda and how he cataloged his manuscripts and how he worked with his collection. So ELS, the ELS number that is printed, really, right? It's printed in purple ink and then the rest is filled in by hand, is an abbreviation for Ellsworthy Road, which is the London street where Yehuda lived. And he was actually neighbors of Sigmund Freud in London. And these ELS numbers are found at Yehuda collections across the world. And they correspond, number 2361 corresponds somehow to his own personal internal cataloging system. Even though we've had the Yehuda collection at the National Library for more than 50 years, it's only now that archive is actually being scanned, being fully cataloged. And it's hoped that this work will help us gain more insight into his own collecting practices. So perhaps we can discover the provenance, or a little bit more information about the provenance of this copy of Avicenna's canon, and as well as other works, and also to learn more about how he organized and how he evaluated, studied, and preserved the manuscripts that were in his collection. So Yehuda's collection arrived in the National Library of Israel in 1967, which was, if you remember, Yehuda died in 1951. This is more than 15 years later. The reason for the delay was that there was a court case about a court case and a suit over who this collection really belonged to, a suit that the National Library won in the late 60s, and then the collection was transferred thereafter. And just as when the Goldziher Library came to Jerusalem in 1924, the library hired a dedicated scholar to work on that Islamic and Arabic material. In 1970, the library hired Ephraim Wust, whose picture you can see here. He's the young man in glasses in the very center. Wust had completed his studies at the Islam and Middle Eastern department of the Hebrew University. And his is the second story that I'd like to tell you today. So just about this image, which is actually one of the few images that we have in the library collection of Ephraim Wust, even though he was an extremely important figure in our institution's recent history. It's from a 1970 exhibition of rare manuscripts and printed books. And if I'm not sure you can see, it might be cropped off, but at the bottom of the picture, you can see they're surrounding a copy of the Quran from the Yehuda Collection. The individual on the left side of the screen, the far left in glasses, is Zalman Shazar, then president of Israel, and the older gentleman on the right, next to Ephraim Wust, is I think Shlomo Hugo Bergmann, also a pivotal figure in the library's history. Its former director, and Ephraim is, of course, smiling and looking down at the manuscript in the center. So he had, interestingly, no prior experience in Arabic manuscripts or manuscript cataloging, and also almost no supervision. And over the course of the decades, he devised his own cataloging system based on autodidactic readings of then published catalogs of the great Oriental manuscript collections. During the next 10 years, from 1970 to 1980, he prepared a preliminary catalog of the entire Yehuda collection by hand, and then transferred, in draft form, and then transferred it to a card catalog, a catalog that physically still sits in the library's manuscript cataloging room in the basement. So after focusing on other manuscript traditions in Hebrew and other Jewish languages to the library, he returned in 1986 to work on the remaining Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts. Now, as I already mentioned, and as Jeff pointed out, part of our manuscript collection did not come from Yehuda, but was included manuscripts that were acquired and came to the library over the last century, from 1924 till today. So the heart of this collection, known as the AR collection, the AR just standing as an abbreviation for Arabic, includes 600 items. And it really is a very eclectic collection. It covers a diverse range of topics, includes both rare Qur'ans from around the world, from Indonesia, Timbuktu, North Africa, and elsewhere, Ottoman legal documents, letters from sultans, land deeds, all kinds of other documentary materials. Scriptures, there's a collection of the scriptures of the Druze religion, one of the minority religions here in Israel, as well as in Lebanon and Syria. Timurid Persian astronomical texts, and all kinds of other things. If the Yehuda Collection is the jewel in the crown of our Islamic manuscript collection, the AR sort of is as I said, much more eclectic and in a way even more interesting, because those interested in the history and provenance of the collection can study the many routes and the many ways that manuscripts made their way to Jerusalem. So the National Library is indebted to Ephraim Vos on a number of counts. So first of all, he decided to catalog our entire manuscript collection in Arabic, a language that he learned and mastered, and rather than in English transcription, which was and remains the standard at the time. In part, this decision was in keeping with the library's general policy to catalog materials by the script in which they're written. So Hebrew books are cataloged in Hebrew, as are Yiddish books in Ladino, and Persian, Ottoman Turkish, and Urdu works are cataloged in Arabic, as are all books in Arabic, right? It's a division by script. But rather than being a technical choice, this actually meant the library's Islamic manuscript collection, as well as the now digitized manuscripts themselves, which I'll say more about digitization in a little bit. The entire collection, the records are readable and accessible to Arabic speakers across the world, and that's something that we're very proud of, and that we try to do our best to promote access to the collection. So just as important, Vos cataloging was especially comprehensive, exacting, and dedicated. So rather than just brief and superficial descriptions of a codex and its contents, he attempted to fully describe and fully just record every relevant detail of the manuscript. And his work is really renowned and prized among codicologists in the field until today. So this dedication, though, sometimes bordered on and even crossed over the border into perfectionism. He worked and reworked his catalog for decades, which is why only a few years ago the catalog of the Yehuda Collection was actually published, and why there are no published catalogs of the AR collection. It's also why he only allowed a small circle of scholars here in Jerusalem and a few international figures to actually view the manuscripts, until none of the cataloging records were actually entered into the National Library computers until after the year 2000. And he worked to preserve the collection at the expense of opening it up to scholars and the general public. So I want to give one example of how this dedication played out as relates to our Islamic medical manuscript collection. So in 1998, a very unique and very important medical archive, I guess you might call it, was purchased by the library from local Israeli dealers. Rather than containing a single work, as in the case of Yehuda's 13th century canon, the 23 manuscripts, 7 printed books, and numerous letters, receipts, prescription slips, notes, and amulets were all part of the same purchase. They actually belonged originally to a Jewish Iranian family of physicians dating from the late 18th century to the 1940s. The family, and we catalog it as the Gol Paigan collection, or the Rahmian collection, as I'll explain. The family was based in the central Iranian city of Gol Paigan, which was located some 200 kilometers from Isfahan and about 150 kilometers from the important Shia religious center of Qom. The manuscripts and books belong to 6 generations of doctors, and they recorded not just their names, right, as previous owners, as in the case we saw before, They also wrote down family births, deaths, their travels, poems in some cases, who they bought books from and where, when copies were made, a wealth of information. And what you can see here on the PowerPoint is one of the opening pages of one of the manuscripts in the collection, an important, one of the works by Giorgiani, right, an important figure in medieval medical history. And you can see both in Persian, in Arabic script, right, and Judeo-Persian, how many, we're looking at a zoom up of the page, but this is how many notes crisscrossing in various directions and angles these manuscripts contain. So the collection, like, this physician's archive, if we can call it that, really show what books, what works were part of a doctor's library in early modern Iran. The works include textbooks written by the 12th century physician and philosopher Giorgiani, who I just mentioned. He's actually best known for his Zakhireh Khwarazm Shahi, a medical encyclopedia dedicated to the ruler of the province of Khwarazm in eastern Iran. It also includes the therapeutic manual Dastur-e-Ilaj by the 16th century Sultan Ali Khorasani, a compendium on diseases and their treatments by the late 17th century Sufi physician Muhammad Akbar Arzani in his Tib-e Akbari, a short treatise by the late 18th century Muhammad Hussein ibn Muhammad Hadi on the reasons for longevity, and more and more. Some of the manuscripts are not contain more than a single work, but they're compendia containing 3 or more different treatises, which were then bound together. So the number of works is actually much larger than the number of physical items. And in addition to Persian manuscripts in Arabic script, there are also 3 manuscripts in Judeo-Persian, the language, of course, of the Jews of Iran. These contain various texts, both written originally in Judeo-Persian and also transcriptions into Hebrew characters of Persian works. And this is just an example of one page. If anyone reads Persian, you might not know the Hebrew script, but here, if you can see where my mouse is circling the large text on the unnumbered page where it says Babe Sevom, right? The third, Babe Dovom, the second chapter. If you read Judeo-Persian out loud to a native Persian speaker, it's entirely comprehensible. So in terms of the provenance of this collection, it seems that the manuscripts arrived in Israel with a certain Dr. Yitzhak Rachmian, himself an Iranian Jewish physician who moved to Israel from Iran in the mid-20th century. In a 1953 note in one of the manuscripts, which actually helps us date when he was in the country and is the final date in the collection as a whole. Rachmian writes of his intention to donate the collection to the National Library of Israel, or actually the Hebrew University. So he writes here, and to have drawn it up, Hakidaros hiç kas dode nemishevad, yek hediye be danshgah Ibri dar Eretz Israel, Dr. Rachmian, right? The right of ownership has not been given to anyone for this book. It's a gift to the Hebrew University of the land of Israel, and the land of Israel, of course, is written in Hebrew script. Dr. Rachmian, and then the date. So I don't know anything more about him and whether he was actually a member of the family or whether he may have bought the manuscripts or whether the manuscript somehow came into his possession through other means. But in the end, the manuscripts were sold to an Israeli dealer, as I said, and the library purchased them nearly 50 years after this note was written. So Ephraim Wust And this is typical of his cataloging and his investment. Didn't just write down the information about the manuscripts, the sort of the basic details. He used this archive to reconstruct the family tree. As I said, the different manuscripts record births, deaths, all kinds of events. And as part of his work, Ephraim Voss went through and identified the name of the patriarch of the family, Reuven ben Yeshayahu. And you can see here a note, that he himself wrote in Judeo-Persian in the Hebrew script. He identified Reuven's sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, all the way down the family tree, as well as the names of individuals who don't seem to be connected to this family. At the same time, each of the manuscripts was, when it arrived at the library, was interleaved with notes, receipts, other papers, amulets in Hebrew and in Persian. This entire collection is of notes is archived at the library and is organized by the manuscript from which they were taken. So it's possible in this way to really reconstruct and the entire physician's archive, and it's all thanks to Ephraim. So the note you can see here records actually the manuscript's purchase, right? This is from Ikhtiyarati Badai, a work that I'm actually not familiar with, though I've done some research about it, but I wanted to highlight here. This is where Reuven mentions that he bought the manuscript from the Said Walid Hussein Ali Beg in Qom, and writes his name, the name of his father, and also the date, which is 1783. So we know that Reuven was traveling in Qom, that he had business relations with prominent members of the Muslim community, perhaps clerics. He also records in the same manuscript the birth of one of his children, Babai, born in 1787. Again, the note is in Judeo-Persian. The name Babai is right here. That's the name that I'm circling. On this date, 1787, my son Babai was born, and then he gives the particular Hebrew date, including the Jewish year, and signs again with his name, Reuven, the son of Yeshayahu. There's another ownership note in further manuscript as part of the collection, which he received, and here the note is in Here the note is in both, or is again in Judeo-Persian. I received this book from Ismail Sheikh al-Islam, and he gives the date that the note was written in 1795, and again signs his name, Reuven. Above the note, there's a stamp, which I believe is Reuven's own stamp, actually, if I'm not mistaken. In other notes, in other manuscripts, he records further travels to Qom, and we even know that he died. One of his sons mentions him in an additional marginal note in one of the Judeo-Persian manuscripts, and working out the chronology, we realize that Reuven, the son of Yeshayahu, died in 1826. So I want to emphasize how rare and how special and how fortunate we are at the National Library of Israel to have had Ephraim Wust as the cataloger for these many years. He's now retired, and we're doing our best to continue the work and the investment that he began. And the way that we're doing that, in part, is by being sure that all these manuscripts are as widely available as possible, and that all of his own work, investment in fully describing and fully examining and studying them, is also available to researchers, scholars, students, writers, translators, and the general public around the world. So the way that we're doing that is through a project of digitization. So thanks to a very generous donation from Arcadia, a charitable fund of Elizabeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin, we've received a 3-year grant to scan all 2,500 of our Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts. At this point, actually 95% of the collection is already scanned and is already available online. All of the images that I showed you today were taken off our website. So anyone interested can go to nli.org.il and search by subject, search by work, search by author, and to get to the scanned versions of the manuscripts, which are also freely available for downloading, sharing. There are no copyright restrictions and no need to, and our only request is that users recognize that these manuscripts come from the library collection. In addition to the scanning and digitization, we're working on metadata improvement to double check and to make sure that no errors remain in the cataloging records themselves, to translate relevant information to English, and to build a searchable online portal dedicated just to our Islamic manuscript collection. The portal will be available in English, Hebrew, and in Arabic, and is meant to serve scholars, scholars here in Israel, scholars around the world, who want to further study and work on our medical collection and all of our manuscripts. So I think on that positive note, I'll stop. And thank you again to the National Library of Medicine for this opportunity to present, and I'd be happy to take any questions that there might be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thrope. Sam, if I may, fantastic tour and wonderful images, and I learned so much myself. We have a bunch of questions that have come in, and I'll just remind our viewers that there's a live feedback button underneath the live stream, and you can use that button to send questions to Sam, to myself, and I'll triage those questions for him. We did receive several questions, Sam, about access to these collections, both online and in person. And so several people said, can you point to where they can be seen online? And you've done so. But can you speak to the policies and procedures for in-person access? So what does one need to do to come to the library and consult these materials personally?
Okay, that's a great question. So first of all, again, I'll say that anyone puts National Library of Israel into Google for online access, you come to the webpage. It's available in English. You can search there and get to the digitized manuscripts that way. Please come here to Jerusalem. We would love to welcome you. The library is open to all, and there are no special procedures or requirements to study the manuscripts. There's a simple form that has to be filled out, and of course, the manuscripts have to be ordered to a special reading room. But for one of the values of the library is the democratization of knowledge, and our efforts in digitization are pointed towards that goal. But also, we invest a great deal and to be an open institution. In March, we're actually moving from our current site on the Hebrew University campus to a new building, which will be make it even easier to visit in a way.
Wonderful. That's great news. Before I move to the next question, I'll just say that several have written in to say thank you very much for your presentation. And one person writes, beautiful work and much appreciated. Another question that's come in, have there been activities or future plans to collaborate with libraries of the Islamic countries where these items originated?
Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes. We just in the past year, well, I'll say a couple of things. So just recently, as we all know, Israel signed new accords with the United Arab Emirates, with Morocco, and with Bahrain. And representatives, there have already been contacts between libraries in those countries and the National Library of Israel, and we're looking forward to collaborating more. Morocco, of those three countries, Morocco, of course, has the largest manuscript collections of its own, and there's talk about how we can work together. In addition, I'm actually heading to Uzbekistan on Wednesday next week as part of a conference on Uzbek cultural heritage, and many of the manuscripts in our collection, not medical manuscripts per se, but originate in Samarkand, Bukhara, Kokand, and other historical cities in Uzbekistan, also elsewhere in Central Asia. So there's a lot of collaboration in those directions, and we are always open to and look forward to contact with scholars and students and interested parties from all over the region. The library has an active Arabic language webpage and also reference services in Arabic. And we receive questions from people living in Ramallah, people living in Gaza, people living in Egypt, in Iraq, across the Arab world, also from Iran. And we're always happy to engage and to answer whatever questions we can.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Before I move on to a rather specific question, which is very interesting, for those of you who are wondering if this fantastic presentation will be available, it will be in the NIH videocast archive of NIH History of Medicine events. This recording will be available within the next week or so, with appreciation of the NIH videocast team. So there will be a recording. And if you contact me, my email, jeffrey.reznick, R-E-Z-N-I-C-K, @nih.gov, I'll be happy to let you know when the recording is available, and certainly also, Sam, to you and your colleagues, so they can appreciate this talk that you've given, as well as your colleagues at the National Library of Israel. We have a specific question that's come in. Since it appears that they were separated before Yehuda got the work, could the first and last leaves of ELS number 2361 MED be held and cataloged by another repository as a fragment? And forgive me for not communicating the catalog number properly.
That is a great question. The short answer is I don't know, but I suspect that not. I mean, the manuscript was rebound, and it seems that it was rebound by Yehuda himself. Or if not himself, that he was responsible for the new binding. And he was not in the practice of taking manuscripts apart. There are a few cases where, let's say, there's a multi-volume work. I know an example of the Hadith compendium of Bukhari, where one volume is in Jerusalem and another volume is in Princeton. And I'm sure other cases where a volume of a work is at the National Library of Medicine and another part is here. That being said, it's quite rare that he would do so, and I would be very, very surprised if he took folios out and sold them separately. It's a testament to his scholarship that he didn't take things sort of break them apart and sell them piecemeal.
Very good. Thank you very, very much. We have another specific question, but before we do get to that, several questions have come in about the conservation of the collection in advance of digitization. And could you share a few words about that process, challenges that were faced? Obviously, any challenges have been wonderfully overcome. You stated 95% of the collection is available digitally, which is just fantastic. Can you say a little bit about the conservation process? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely, and thanks for the reminder, because I wanted to talk about that. So before scanning, all the manuscripts were checked by the library's conservation team. So we have a very large manuscript collection. The total number of which it actually escapes me at the moment, but the conservation team at the library is working constantly to check, approve, and fix whatever items are might be damaged or any problems that have arisen over the years. One of the things we're most careful about is mold, of course, right? Because mold infects books, and it can go from book to book. So in order to prevent sort of an outbreak of mold in the manuscript collection, all the manuscripts are kept in a special rare book room on rare book stacks in climate-controlled conditions. Each manuscript is checked before it's scanned, after it's scanned, and also every time before it's shown to visitors or as part of an exhibit. And that's, in fact, the reason why 95% of the collection is scanned and not 100% of the collection. The manuscripts that are remaining have already been infected with mold, or suspected of being so. And because of that, there are a number of digitization projects going on at the library, and mold is a factor, concern for all of them. So there's been a dedicated scanner set up with a dedicated team in a sealed room where they only deal with mold items using the necessary protective gear and masks and gloves and etc. And just because there's a bottleneck of a lot of items that need to be scanned and only one scanner, the mold infected items are going to take months to sort of make their way through the system. That's a bit of a headache because some of the manuscripts I wanted to show you actually haven't been scanned yet. But it's worth it, both to protect the library staff, of course, but also to protect the collection. And in the new building, when we move there, we're going to have. I'm excited to see the state-of-the-art instruments and facilities that we'll have there for conservation. It's one of our main concerns and is always at the top of the agenda when it comes to the manuscripts.
Thank you. So another question we've gotten that relates to the 95% achievement is, given that 95% of these collections are digitally available, can you speak to the importance of consulting them in person? What are the aspects that are valuable?
Wow, that's a great question. So Lena Jabali, who I've already mentioned a few times, and the great member of the team, you should invite her to give a presentation in the next series of docs. So her concern, and I've learned a lot from her about digital codicology and the difference between consulting a manuscript on a screen and consulting a manuscript physically. We all know manuscripts, of course, are three-dimensional objects. In a way, they're more akin to, statues and paintings than they are to printed books. They have volume, they have physicality, they have chemical structure, and there's all kinds of features that you can see either with the naked eye, actually facing the book, or with special lights, with using the resources of the laboratory to date manuscripts. just with touch, feeling the binding, inspecting the threads that you can't do on a digital image. My own personal opinion is that the added value in most cases is very small. If you're concerned with the text, and especially we try and scan at a very, very high resolution to enable, zooming in on an image to see a stamp or a marginal note or even a watermark in some cases. But in some cases, the difference is really important between examining the physical object and the scan. So just actually last week, and I mentioned this in passing, we have a manuscript of Ibn Sina's Kitab al-Shifa, right? The Book of Healing is important philosophical work, which Ephraim was dated to the 11th century, which would make it, I think, one of the earliest manuscripts of the Book of Healing in the world, or at least of the first part. It's very rare to find a manuscript written within or close to Ibn Sina's own lifetime. This manuscript, though, lacks a colophon. It lacks any notes, dates, indications of any kind that would tell you that it's 11th century. And when we spoke with experts in the field, they said on the basis of the handwriting, it seems like actually much later, at least 200, 300 years later. So I thought that this was wishful thinking, let's say. However, we wanted to confirm, so we took a sample of the paper, and there's great pictures of the expert from the Weizmann Institute of Science here in Israel coming and cutting a thin sliver of paper from the edge of the manuscript. And that was 4 months ago, and we just got the results from the lab that it is actually 11th century. That it's a confirmation of Ephraim's work. I have no idea how he identified the date of the manuscript on the basis of looking at it alone. But in this case and in others, you really had to be there physically. The scan isn't good enough.
Understood. And that research is really essential in your institution and ours and everyone, of course. So that's really important perspective. Thank you. We have another rather specific question I'd like to share with you. So this person writes in, there are many manuscripts, including medical, I think this person's saying there are many medical related manuscripts in Timbuktu and the Sahara Desert. And is there any work in regards to those materials being acquired by the National Library of Israel to help kind of round out the collection and to ensure their preservation and their access?
Not at the moment, though I'd be interested to learning more. I know that there's I think it's an Italian project to actually work with manuscript collections in Timbuktu and throughout sub-Saharan Africa to preserve them, to scan, catalog, digitize also. So work is certainly being done, not at the National Library of Israel, and in part that's for budgetary reasons, but it's about the scope of the collection. The Islam and Middle East collection, manuscripts and other materials, focuses first and foremost on the Levant, the Middle East as a whole, especially this heartland of the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, as well as Iran, North Africa, and then fearily, sort of with decreasing importance the further you get from that central location. So sub-Saharan Africa has never been actually a focus of our collecting, though we have some items from there. Quran from Timbuktu that made its way into the collection. But we're always interested in expanding, and we're always interested in collaborating with other institutions. So if there's more specific information, I'd be glad to hear it. I'm easy to find. My email is out there and available. So on this point and others, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. One last, not really question, but an appropriate comment has come in, and with this, we'll conclude. An excellent talk. Appreciate your work and best wishes for the future. Many have written in with great appreciation for this talk, Sam. Thank you. And I want to thank you on behalf of the National Library of Medicine for preparing this talk and helping us understand the collections that you hold and the relationship to the collections that we hold, and this very rich, important ecosystem of collections, and the connectedness between our institutions and those others around the world is very important, always, but especially during these times of international relations, and providing access to researchers and learners all over the world as we increasingly digitize, but also preserve these wonderful collections for future generations. So personally and on behalf of the NLM, thank you very, very much. I hope our paths cross one day. Certainly welcome here in due course as things return to a normal in our societies. And I wish you and your family well. I hope your kids enjoyed pizza. And I hope all remains well with you and your colleagues at the National Library of Israel. Thank you very, very much, and all best to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much again. Thanks for the opportunity. I look forward to meeting in Jerusalem or in the DC area as soon as we can.
Wonderful. Very good. All the best. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.